This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale and today I'm delighted to be talking to Ehsan Khoshbakht. He is the co-director of the Bologna Film Festival, Cinema Ritrovato Film Festival I should say, and he's also the programmer of a retrospective at the Locarno Film Festival looking back at 100 years of the Columbia studio called The Lady with the Torch. He's also edited a book with regard to that retrospective that accompanies the retrospective, and I was delighted to have him on the show to talk about Columbia Studios and the program which is going to be presented at Locarno this week. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to spread the love on the social media. Send me an email if you have any questions or suggestions for possible guests, or you can message me via Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
Nice. Yeah, well, in a way, the books are still the best thing in the world. You know, everything I learn in my work, I learn from books. It's so amazing that you learn something from watching film. You learn something from discussions with colleagues and experts. But books, it's endless because there's always something about written about almost any film somewhere, and you have to find it. And it's something that grabs your attention. Oh, it tells you something that you were not aware of. So books, for me, are the map to the road, any road.
I just think of it as like the Umberto Eco idea of the library. And you go into a library and you've got brains they're just brains all around you that you can dip into and sort of extract the knowledge from. It's like a science fiction thing, you know. It's like a magic thing. They travel through time and space.
Yeah, it's for me working on the Columbia program towards the end when I was about to like produce some notes, blurbs, things like that. So I was checking usually when you want to write about a film, let's say a Columbia film. So first you check whether it is in a book on the director of the film. Occasionally there is something written on or by the screenwriter of the film, and then you have the stars. So you think, okay, there's one about Henry Fonda, there's one about this. So you just compare all of them. And in many cases, of course, they repeat the same stories. It comes from, an original source, whatever it is, and then it is. But then the variations, the tiny variations here and there, they are very interesting. You always long for that extra bit of information that someone has. And then when you put them together, you say, wow, I know a great deal more about this film than 10 minutes ago. And everything is in this room and my living room on the other side of the flat. And it's just so incredible. There's something really treasurable about this whole book business.
Yeah, you don't have to sell me on it. I'm a complete. Our whole attic is just because we have a sort of.
It's a loft.
A loft, yeah, exactly. That's it, a loft, and it's amazing. So let's talk about this Columbia. I'm assuming it's like a centenary that's being celebrated.
It is a centenary indeed, and it has been celebrated in many different parts of the world, especially in North America. From what I have observed, mostly a smaller program and programs dedicated to the big titles, the major classics of the studio, like the Lawrence of Arabia, the Bridge on the River Kwai, Gilda, On the Waterfront, etc., etc. But what is interesting is, we'll get into that later, but in my definition of a Columbia picture, a film like The Bridge on the River Kwai and On the Waterfront don't have any space because these films were produced with a great degree of independence from the studio. They were by independent producers produced for Columbia Pictures. And the main character, or one of the leading characters in my story, Harry Cohn, the president of Columbia Pictures, had absolutely no say in these projects. And because of that, he hated these films, even though they won him Oscars and plenty of prestige for Columbia Pictures.
I was just thinking Lawrence of Arabia really is Sam Spiegel's film more than it is Harry Cohn's film.
Absolutely, yeah, no, totally. And in the program, I focus on some examples of the independent productions in the golden age of Columbia Pictures before the dawn of sound era until the end of the 50s. But I have excluded films that were done, totally independently from the studio. Of course, it's not a Columbia film. The most obvious example is the Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is not an MGM film, even though it was distributed by MGM and had MGM's logo. It remains a David Selznick film. Same about Lawrence of Arabia. It is part of the studio legacy, but I was trying to focus on the in-house productions and the productions in which Harry Cohn or his associate had a strong say and a significant influence.
So when does when does that's a stupid question. 100 years ago, that's when Columbia starts. How does Columbia start as a studio? What's its sort of the story of its birth?
Well, the studio started with the two Cohn brothers, Harry and Robert, from a Jewish family born in New York, streetwise, sharp-tongued, and they started this film distribution company before Columbia Pictures was founded. That eventually, with the help of another collaborator, morphed into Columbia Pictures. It changed its name from CBC, I believe, Cohn, Brandt, Cohn, to Columbia Pictures. And then they introduced the now iconic image of a woman standing on a pedestal, holding a burning bright torch. In some versions, also carrying an American flag, which became the logo of Columbia Pictures. The studio in its early years, after it became Columbia, had a relatively limited output, and the films were quite modest. For instance, Columbia Pictures is not known for having that many remarkable silent films. But
Right.
with the sound, I think they kind of found the angle that could make them different from other studios and their output more distinctive. And it became, throughout the early 30s, became basically the major Hollywood force that we know today.
And so, as it developed an identity, and many students of this early period will know that studios would specialize in sort of genres or have certain excellences. What was Columbia's sort of speciality at this period? In this period,
by the mid 30s, all the major Hollywood studios had developed what we call today the house style or the studio signature. MGM and musicals, Warner Brothers and gangster films. For Columbia, it arrived a bit later, and I would say even to the end of the 50s, house style was more eclectic in a very pleasant, in a very dynamic way. So the person who put Columbia Pictures on the map was director Frank Capra, who made the main bulk of his filmography for the studio from the late 20s, from the silent day, until the late 30s. He made more than 20 films, Columbia Pictures, and with the success, both artistic and commercial success of these films like It Happened One Night, You Can't Take It With You, all of a sudden, Columbia Pictures started winning Oscars. At the same time, Harry Cohn became aware of the power of the director as the star, rather than having a galaxy of stars, which would have been unaffordable for a studio with kind of relatively meager resources. So the famous name above the title of Frank Capra's autobiography, became a Columbia trend. That in Columbia films, you see the name appears above the title. Even directors that are totally forgotten today, you see Leslie Ruggles' Arizona. You see Gregory Lacava's this and that. So what Capra gave to Columbia was a cinema based on probably populist ideas, centered around common people, their joys, disappointments, and their search for that kind of American dream in a sort of language which was very much in tune with the rhetoric of the Roosevelt era. Fast paced, very indoor type of cinema, usually set in a house, few rooms, not much of outdoor experience, not definitely not extravagant sets, and plenty of characters put into this situation, different colorful characters. So Columbia was very good in using its character actor department, secondary actors, very talented, that could add flavor to this film. And basically dissecting the American values and re-establishing them at the end in major classics like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. So that became, to a great extent, the Columbia house style in the 30s. But Columbia was also a very vibrant studio because it did not have the long-term contracts like other studios, the infamous 7-year contracts, basically enslaving talents. Columbia didn't have that. So people were popping in and out all the time and staying there for one picture deal, two picture deal, then out, coming back, being hired on a week-to-week basis even. And that was that allowed for different types of Columbia Pictures product emerging from the famous departure of Frank Capra in the late 30s after major disagreements with Harry Cohn to the end of the 50s. And so people who argue that Columbia Pictures is Frank Capra, they should bear in mind that when Capra left, instead of the studio falling apart, it actually got better and better because the production was fully established and streamlined. They knew the types of pictures they wanted to, and it just started to grow in not one direction, but perhaps 5 or 6 different directions, including in adventure mystery films, including a bit later on in what we call today screwball comedy. It became the screwball. And one of the main focuses of this retrospective, films with and about women, in some cases directed or produced or written by women. That became one of the most unusual expertise of Columbia Pictures. When I say unusual, because you don't expect that coming from a studio that is run by a person who's known as being a tyrant, a misogynist person, but Columbia offered a great degree of freedom as long as these talents stayed within the budget. Everything was about the money, like other studios, but within that given budget, they could experiment and they could try out new things.
About Harry Cohn as a personality, of course, I mean he's famous for as you say his tyrannical personality, and there was a famous line after his funeral was seen to be absolutely packed. A local wit said, "Give the people what they want, and they will come." Um, so,
Mm.
so what I mean, do you find that reputation is well earned?
That reputation is definitely well earned because he was a difficult character. But now, after more than a year of researching him and watching the films, I think I can understand some of his frustration or some of the perhaps psychological explanations for the way they behave. First of all, Harry Cohn had a very fraught relationship with his brother. It was absolutely terrible. It was an ongoing war since the 20s until the end of his brother's life because he died first. He had perhaps inferiority complex because he was surrounded by some of the most sophisticated writers in America. All these East Coast urban people who had read books, who knew music and everything. So they were giving him all the great things that made Columbia work for Harry. But at the same time, he was someone whose vocabulary was very often limited to the F word, F this and F that, and that was him. And also, perhaps I have come to understand that perhaps he also had some issues with his Jewish cultural background, because there's this well, first of all, like many other studios during the Second World War, they were extremely reluctant to get into making films about the war or addressing the Jewish situation in Europe directly. Harry Cohn was no exception in this. It also applies to other studios. But of course, when Harry Cohn responded to it, the range and the depth of anti-fascist films produced at Columbia Pictures is really staggering. Again, thanks to a good number of communist writers who were active in Columbia Pictures. Harry Cohn, good or bad, he did not care about the political belief of people who worked for him. He used to belittle him, you rat son of a bitch, and this and that. But at the end of the day, he only cared about the pictures. So they produced all these films. But he was fascinated by the idea of becoming a Christian, a Catholic, because he was married to a Catholic. And when he died, I think when he died in 1958, he had a heart attack and he was out on the street somewhere. And because he used to use the F word a lot, when he felt that he was having the heart attack, he just wanted to say, "Oh, fuck." But I guess because in that moment it was not a moment you expect to face in your life. All of a sudden he said, "Christ, like Christ, I can't believe this is happening to me." So that was his last word, and then he died. And then, of course, this question should be answered by the experts in Catholic culture and theology, that how can one be baptized as a Catholic after his death? But he was baptized as a Catholic. And so when they had the famous funeral in the Columbia Soundstage, and of course, now he's Catholic, all the Catholics of Columbia Pictures and old friends were summoned to the ceremony, including director John Ford, who made 5 films for Columbia Pictures. So John Ford was one of the people who carried his coffin. And at the end of the day, someone said, "Jack, what are you doing here?" I said, "I just wanted that son of a bitch is dead." So it was always love and hate with Harry Cohn. Love because he knew what he wanted and he loved making pictures. And he was curious. He was to the point of being open, because curiosity makes you an open person. And his word meant something. When he said something, people could rely on it. And I have heard that from many different people. But at the same time, his approach was appalling. Not necessarily to the people who could face that and say, go to hell, but especially to people who didn't have the courage to face him and talk back or fight against, his, in many cases, irrational, selfish demands. So a figure that was both loved and despised. So I would say it's well earned, but he had many other sides.
I like that bit you said earlier about how he's always having to deal with really talented people, and he himself has a sort of limited capacity. He can do the money side, but not necessarily understand the creativity. One of those figures who I think is included in your retrospective is Orson Welles, who I think in a way there's a bit of me that always wonders whether Welles, if he could swallow some of his own pride, would have been able to work with someone like Cohen more and more if he could have, because the Lady from Shanghai, which is the movie that he made with Cohen, Orson Welles has this story that he did it on a phone call and picked up a book at random and said, "Okay, this is the title, buy the rights and I'll make this for you." Yeah, I mean, I don't know how reliable that version of the story is.
It can be true because you come across many similar stories told by other directors. The art of making pictures for Columbia Pictures as an independent filmmaker, as an independent voice, meant face-to-face conversations and negotiations with Harry Cohn. John Ford famously deducted something around $2,000 from his annual tax report because based on the money spent on his yacht, because he said he had to invite, as a freelancer, he had to invite Harry Cohn to his yacht to spend a few days with him and negotiate some of these projects that he eventually made for Columbia Pictures. So it was an integral part of securing a job as a freelancer. So you hear stories like that. In Welles's case, what you suggest that, had he agreed to swallow some of his pride, he could have made more pictures. I do agree, but it depends also on your view on Orson Welles. Welles as a failed Hollywood director, or Welles as a successful experimental filmmaker. I tend to think of Welles as a successful experimental filmmaker. So he was in many different places and he experimented with many different things, including one picture for Harry Cohn. And this picture for Harry Cohn, which is quintessential Orson Welles, at the same time, surprisingly, is a very Columbia film, meaning that not only has the leading Columbia star Rita Hayworth and deconstructs the image of Rita Hayworth, but also plays on some of the stylistic motifs of Columbia films prior to The Lady from Shanghai. It's right into the Columbia's main expertise in the 40s, adventure film, mystery slash adventure film. So it's made within the tradition, but as an Orson Welles film. And that's an example of the type of freedom that Harry Cohn could offer to directors that he believed in. And the film is, especially today, looks more unusual than ever. It's very eclectic. It's very staccato, very Wellesian, of course, but there is no precedent for it in Columbia Pictures. So that's when and where I give a credit to Harry Cohn as a person open to risks. And you see that in many other directors who had this kind of one-off wonders with Columbia Pictures, in some cases too. Frank Borzage, Man's Castle is a remarkable film. There were one of his films by directors like Nicholas Ray, who later returned to make films by independent production units in Columbia Pictures, and many other directors. So that was the place to go to, in a way, if you wanted to do something slightly different.
It was almost sort of a last chance saloon of a studio that you could go if you were in trouble with other studios. You could go and find work there and do something maybe with a bit more freedom if you kept within the budget.
That's right, and it was also the place to start a career from the scratch. That's why the B unit of Columbia Pictures is so important, because many of the great names in the history of American cinema, directors like Joseph H. Lewis, Edward Dmytryk, John Sturges, and many others, Bob Whittaker, they all either started there or made the first significant series of films for Columbia Pictures. And the reason to argue that probably they were not entirely uncomfortable is that many of them returned. William Castle returned as a sort of director-producer. So he had his 40s kind of phase, and then there was another one in the 50s. Edward Dmytryk returned, and so did many other directors. Andre de Toth did the same thing. So it means that they could feel comfortable. They knew the barriers and the limitations of working for Columbia Pictures, but also the advantages of directing and producing for the studio.
When you have a retrospective for a studio, you have so many films to choose from and so much of a back catalogue. How do you go about selecting films to present as a programmer?
By following my instincts. In this case, when I decided to do this, I knew what I didn't want to do. Because in the past few years, we have seen some similar program of the celebration of a studio. And they have shown some wonderful films, but they were mostly the titles that one expects to see in the celebration of the studio. All the big titles from the canon, all the classics, right? And usually the tendency is that the celebration of the studio focuses on the stars because the studios were famous for the star system. So if you do Warner Brothers tribute, you focus on Errol Flynn and Betty Davis and James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart and so on and so on. I said, can we do a program on the history of the studio by focusing on the director? So in other words, trying to search for the studio style, the studio signature style, and at the same time acknowledge and re-endorse the power of the individual voice and the authorship within the studio system. That was my main question. And if you wanted to do that, you could not do it without studying the relation between each project and person and the head of the studio, Harry Cohn, right? So that became like the starting point of the project. And then another minor complaint that I had about similar retrospectives was that because it was all about the great classic titles, it was giving a kind of inaccurate overview of the studio because all studios were producing a great number of B movies, and there were many great films produced within the B units of the studio. So for me, it was important to show not only the major classics and big names of the studio, but also lesser known films and films made by directors who are forgotten today or were never ever appreciated since their careers ended in the 50s and 60s. So this became like the starting point. And then in order to start this investigation, I printed an entire release calendar of Columbia Pictures between 1929 to 1959. And I tried to watch film from at least every month in the release calendar of the Columbia to get a sense of the kind of day-to-day activities of Columbia Pictures, the different strands and cycles and ideas and motifs that kind of carry on for a while, morph into something else, or are all of a sudden completely dropped in favor of a new thing. With this system, I could also detect the arrival of new talents and voices, and also decide who I want to spend more time on. So you come across a director like, I don't know, John Brom, who made some films for Columbia Pictures, a Jewish filmmaker from Germany living in exile in Hollywood and making films for Columbia Pictures. So this is so fascinating. He has this film called Let Us Live from 1939. And it's absolutely remarkable. The film basically anticipates Hitchcock's Wrong Man, made in the 50s. And when you arrive at that, you see so much brilliance and so much talent. It's okay, maybe I should try to watch every single film that John Brom has done for the studio to make sure that I'm going to include the very best title for this program. So another criteria became one film per director. So it became not only the search for the director, but also the search for the most representative film of that director in terms of the quality of the filmmaking, the modes and of production in Columbia Pictures, responding to different genres and styles, and all these elements kind of created filters that eventually I arrived at my list of 44 titles.
44. That's I mean, from one point of view, that's a small number, and from another point of view, that's a large number.
I don't know if you said this is like a page of my release calendar. So I have, taken notes, I'm marking different films, colors. And this was like my map for doing the retrospective. And so I have watched, like in some cases, more than one film per month of the release calendar.
You watch more than one per month of your release calendar?
Oh, yeah. In some cases, I have seen them like back to back in certain years. Over the years, not just for putting this program together. Like, for instance, the year in the 50s, because I knew films from the 50s better than the films from the 40s and 30s. So there are certain years that I have seen, I would say, more than 75% of the titles they have released.
I'm really interested in this point as well as a programmer that, you don't just pick out the most sort of the greatest hits. You want to look at the most representative, and the most representative might be films that have disappeared. It might be people who are no longer as famous today as they were then. I've just done an article about Richard Burton, and I was asked to choose a sort of top 10 performances, and I wanted to put in films that he did which maybe weren't even popular, but sort of represent how wide his talent was. What sort of film do you feel is in your program that has that sort of attribute?
I think perhaps more than 25% of the films in the program are
Right.
responding to that need of going absolutely not only beyond the familiar canon, but also establishing new facts about the studio and showcasing the talents of filmmakers who are sadly forgotten today. So, for instance, of course, I have Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. It's always wonderful to see Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. But I
Mm.
have some lesser known films by great directors in the program too, like The Whole Town's Talking by John Ford. It's a comedy. Ford is not known as a comedy, but he was extremely talented as a comedy director. Or a film like Gun Fury by Raoul Walsh. Again, Raoul Walsh is relatively well known, and this is an action picture, so it's right in his area of expertise. But nobody has seen this film in its original format since it came out. It's a 3D Western. So we are showing the film in 3D in Locarno. So I wanted
Wow.
to see the film in 3D because it's all about the format. It's all about the way this film should be seen. And then I went in the direction of, again, directors who are relatively well known, at least by people who take it seriously, like Edward Dmytryk. But nobody has seen this film in the program called Underage. This film has not been seen, I'm almost certain. It just vanished. And so I'm showing Underage. And then there are directors who are completely forgotten, but there's wonderful, great, some of them even competing with, the major talents of the studio like Frank Capra. So Roy William Neill and Nick Grindy are just two examples of directors who were enormously talented in the 30s. I'm showing films by these directors. Later on, you have people like John Brom, or again, the fellow German exile, Max Nussek, who directed one film for Columbia Pictures called Girls Under 21. I know the titles are just so crazy.
Underage and girls under 21.
21, yeah, it sounds like some exploitation program, but yeah, why not? You can praise the elements of early exploitation cinema in some of the B movies that making the 30s and 40s, no doubt about it. So it has the entire range from the super famous to, let's say, the white elephant to the termite. It covers the entire range of production at Columbia Pictures between 19.
So when Harry Cohen dies, what direction does the studio take?
It was just sheer coincidence that his date of death kind of coincides with the end of the so-called studio era, the golden age. Various factors have been mentioned for it: the death of long-term contracts, the arrival and popularity of television, and most importantly, the emergence of independent production units and independent producers, and basically some famous stars becoming the producer of their own films. So that's really the end of it. But Harry Cohn dies a year before the end of the retrospective, but he was already fully aware of the changes, and I'm sure he must have felt the confusion in Hollywood, because Columbia Pictures was one of the first studio in Hollywood that embraced the arrival of television and started producing content for television, and also licensing some of the back catalog for broadcast on television. So they were aware of it and fascinated by television as a new medium. And also, if you go through the release calendar, you see between the early 50s and the late 50s, the number of films produced by independent producers for Columbia Pictures are on a steady rise. We already mentioned some titles from the 50s that were done by producers, independent producers, such as On the Waterfront, and they were very successful films. So in terms of business, there was no difference. Perhaps it was easier for them to accept this kind of new mode of production. But at the same time, I can imagine that he was perhaps missing or having some nostalgia for the old days when he was in charge of everything, and every film was passing through his office from the very first draft of the script to the final cut of the movie. So that was really not only the end of Harry Cohn, it was the end of Columbia in a sense. That continued, it continues to this day. Remarkable. But it was never the same thing like other studios. It became many different things and more about media than cinema and more about who buys the studio and who runs the studio and merging with what companies. So it became like a corporate than a studio. In a way, we define the studio system of the golden age.
Earlier, you mentioned a house style as well, and I was wondering about that because if I look at something like Warner Brothers and I see Michael Curtiz as very much sort of putting his stamp on Warner Brothers style, and so that often I think his style disappears because it becomes so influential to Warner Brothers that everybody in Warner Brothers is using him as a template for how to direct films visually. Do you with Columbia? Well, how would you identify that house style? You've already mentioned sort of Orson Welles to some degree is kind of making a Columbia picture stylistic.
As I said, there's no one single house style in Colombia. So that's when the genres become very important to the output of the studio. For instance, one can recognize a kind of a unity of a style to the point of having a clear signature in Colombia screwball comedies made in the 30s and 40s. Mostly because they were often written by the same group of people. They had the same group of stars in them, like there's the sophisticated stars of the studio, Jean Arthur, Byron Dunn, and writers like Robert Riskin. So you see that there. And you also see that in a kind of crime thriller, film noir produced in the 40s and 50s. And in terms of the types of narrative, the way they use the camera. The way, for instance, the way you use the camera in a Columbia film is pretty much informed by the fact that the sets are very modest. So you cannot do too much of elaborate crane shots because there's nothing to show. So the Columbia films become more claustrophobic and use plenty of the old trick of using fog and low-key lighting, which in itself establishes to the concept of film noir. So you can identify the Columbia house style in certain types of genres, but also there are some thematic development in the studio. Like Columbia has, interestingly, a series of films about what I call gadget comedies. So they were very fascinated by the new technologies, radio, recorded music, and later on television, and they have made films about these new mediums and devices in different types of genres. And gradually a type of cinema films emerged in the studio that were about these objects. One person who contributed to this or to the success of these series of films, this cycle, was Frank Tashlin. Frank Tashlin used to work for Columbia Pictures as a screenwriter, and he wrote some of these films that make fun, poke fun at the new inventions, all different types. That kind of 50s consumerist culture is poked fun at by Frank Tashlin at Columbia Pictures. Television, the suburban culture and the consumerism of the suburban culture. So you can just follow the thread of films made about gadgets and devices in Columbia Pictures made between the 30s and the end of the 50s. And I have, briefly touched upon this subject in the book.
And you mentioned earlier, you just mentioned Irene Dunn and a few others of the talents and stars. And you talked about how women behind the camera were managed to create some space for themselves where in other studios they might not have had such opportunities. Could you talk a little bit more about that, please?
One of the major contradictions of Columbia Picture was that even though the studio was ran by one of the most notorious Hollywood producers and Hollywood moguls, Harry Cohn, known for his misogyny and tyranny, it opened the doors to a great number of women, both in front of the camera and behind the camera. So in Columbia Pictures, you have all these career women of screwball comedies, Jean Arthur, Rosalind Russell, and Irene Dunn, who bring a completely new definition of American woman, both pre and post-war, to American films. There are many great examples. One, of course, one of the most famous is His Girl Friday by Howard Hawks. And again, just to remind the listeners that even someone as wonderful as Hawks, as talented as, was making new variations on the pre-existing modes of storytelling in Columbia Pictures. This is one good example because Columbia Pictures had a tradition of making films about journalists from the early 30s, from the early days of sound cinema. So they were producing films like that on a yearly basis. Every year there was like something coming out. So it's the continuation of the same tradition in the studio, but now with a type of feminist edge, with a strong emphasis on the reversal of gender roles, because the first version of the film was with two guys basically competing with each other instead of, former husband and wife in Howard Hawks' film. So there was a screwball comedy, but then there were also women behind the camera. There were editors, many wonderful writers. Columbia Pictures had the first female executive producer in the history of Hollywood, Virginia Van Opp. And she was responsible for producing some of the studio's greatest hits, like Gilda is a film produced by her. The film Together Again, which is part of the retrospective, is both written and produced by Virginia Van Opp. And then it was in Columbia that someone like Dorothy Arzner could direct two of her finest films, especially my absolute favorite film of her filmography, Craig's Wife, which was, again, made under Harry Cohn's presidency. But the least known aspect of Columbia's female side, and we shouldn't be surprised because after all, it's a studio whose mascot is a woman holding a burning bright torch, standing on a pedestal. But the most unknown and obscure, which this program is only, was this tendency to produce an all-girl version of films that were made in other studios with men. So, for instance, if Warner Brothers made The Wild Boys of the Road by William Wellman, a film about hobos during the Great Depression, Columbia Pictures made Girls of the Road, which is an all-girl movie about girl hobos jumping the trains and crossing the country in search of better life. If other studios were good at producing prison movies and prison dramas, Columbia, that again had a long tradition of doing that, started making films, prison movies with women, including Women's Prison by Louis Saylor, as part of the program. So they were making war movies only with girls, gangster films with girls. It's absolutely brilliant, this tradition. And the film Girls Under 21 is kind of all-female version of The Angels with Dirty Faces by Michael Curtis, Pat Warner, all girls. And there's this tough girl of the neighborhood who's setting a bad example for the other girls. So it's absolutely brilliant. And this is one of the specialties of Columbia that the Locarno program is showcasing, perhaps for the first time.
That's amazing. That just goes to show that sort of gender twisting that, recently got a bad press with things like Ghostbusters and, other films, Ocean's 11 being Ocean's 8 and whatnot, is not a new thing. It's not quite as radical or as crazy as we thought it was.
Absolutely not. It was there since the 30s, and even it's completely radical in this, because the examples you gave, it's also a sign of trying to cash on one of your assets. You have the story, you have the characters, so let's make an all-female version of it, or let's make an animation version of it. Different variations for producing revenue for the asset the studio has. In this case, it's also a bit of a cultural dialogue because it is an interaction between two different studios. So if another studio is producing this big budget film with men. Columbia says, okay, we don't have that budget, but we can make an old girl version of it on like a fifth of the budget they have spent on making the film. So it's a dialogue, it's a cultural dialogue between different sectors of American film industry. And I find it extremely, extremely fascinating. It has echoes, of course, of exploitation. It is exploiting a situation, the demand for a certain type of film. But in the process, it achieves a lot. It adds many new elements to the cultural dialogue that had existed back then, which is even more relevant today and make these films even more enjoyable to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it creates a more varied idea of what, as you were saying earlier, American woman can be, an American lived experience as a woman can be. It can be poverty, it can be prison. It's not always housewife or what have you,
Yeah.
or romantic ideal. But listen, thank you so much for your time. I just wanted to ask one final question before we finish, Ehsan. Obviously, it's going to be difficult for you to pick a favorite and to pick a sort of recommendation. But some of our listeners are not going to be with us in Locarno,
Yeah.
unfortunately. What should they perhaps dig out and watch that would give them maybe give them free films to make a start on before they get the book and they can dig deeper for themselves?
It's so tough. It's absolutely tough
It's a
because
torture.
everything that I have programmed for this retrospective, I absolutely unconditionally believe in for different reasons. I'm not saying all the films have the same quality, but they are interesting or important in their own way. Okay, you put the gun here. Now I'm going to answer. Okay, as an alternative to Frank Capra. Okay, Frank Capra is great. Capra is Capra. Capra has made many of us love cinema. But just to see who else was doing something as good as Capra in the early 30s, there's a film called Washington Merry-Go-Round by James Cruise from 1932, of which we are going to show a 35mm print. This film is, you could say, the model on some of Capra's films, but it goes beyond it and it anticipates Mr. Smith Goes to Washington because it's about political corruption in Washington, and it's about corrupt forces sort of planting a naive character in Washington and then that person rebelling against the corruption of the system. It's really, really wonderful. There's plenty of humor in it. The second film that I would like to recommend is a film called None Shall Escape. This is a film by the Hungarian-born director André de Toth. This program has plenty of edge. Even in comedies, there's kind of an edginess, edgy quality to the film. And this is perhaps one of the greatest examples because this is the film that anticipates the Nuremberg trial. The film is made during the Second World War. It's from 1944, but it anticipates the formation of the United Nations and the Nuremberg trials after the war. It's about the crimes committed in a small Polish village, and then how after the war, a group of people, including people from different races and different countries, it features Black people, Asians, they come together and putting this person responsible for the crimes against humanity on trial. The film is unbelievable. This is a B movie. It's unreal that the B unit of Columbia Pictures was capable of producing a kind of a small masterpiece and a film made not only for its time, but for us now, today, for the future. The film was written by someone who was going to be blacklisted, Lester Cole. He was a member of the Communist Party of America. And the writing is just absolutely brilliant. And I think perhaps the third film, the third title in the program could be a film noir that I love very much. Again, a 35mm print. It's called The Killer That Stalked New York. It's directed by L. McEvoy from 1950. Columbia was very good in allowing people to make films, even if they were not filmmakers. So if you were a writer, second unit director, film editor, or DOP, if you had an itch for filmmaking, you were allowed to make films. and this is just one example. It is based on a true story that someone unknowingly kind of spreads the smallpox virus in New York City, but it's done as a film noir. So the person who does it is on the run from the justice for smuggling some diamond into the country.
Oh, is this with Richard Widmark?
No, no, no. That's very, again, this is Colombia responding in a way to the Richard Widmark movie, which is Panic on the Streets, directed by Elia Kazan. That's a
Right.
Fox film. That's 20th Century Fox. So in Colombia, instead of a man, it's a woman, it's a blonde, it's a femme fatale. But what's the brilliance of the film? The femme fatale as patient zero. That's the key to the film. So she's a femme fatale and she's patient zero, who's going around escaping from the law in New York and spreading the virus. It's shot on location. Again, Colombia was so good to slash the costs by shooting on location. So you get a sense of realism where you don't really expect that to exist. And the killer that has stalked New York would stalk the viewer's memory for a long, long time. It's really powerful.
Excellent, excellent. Oh wow, that's given me three titles to underline in my program before I arrange my other screenings.
But John, I'm not exaggerating that. Of course, some of the titles you know very well, but everything in the program is interesting, especially if there is something that you haven't heard of before. Go and catch it because it could mean nobody else would play that film in the next 50 years.
Oh my God. Now I'm going, I do have to I do have to do some journalism while I'm there, but I'm really looking forward to the retrospective. I'm looking forward to the book. So unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to read it yet, but when I have, it'd be great to have you back on at some point and maybe talk that over as well.
Yeah, the book is, I'm quite proud of the text in the book and the quality of the production. It was done in a very, very short time, but I'm quite happy with it. And there are essays about some of these unsung heroes of Columbia Pictures in the book.
Excellent. The Lady with the Torch. That's
Maybe.
fantastic.
Wait, a friend of mine calls the book "The Lady with the Touch" because instead of the torch, you have the legs of the famous legs from the 20th century where Howard Hawks kicking John Barrymore's ass. So the Lady with the Touch rebranded now because of the cover.
Brilliant, brilliant. I look forward to seeing you next week, Ehsan, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. I'll see you in Locarno, okay?